Hello again. Welcome back. Love you guys that keep coming back for more episodes of the Challenger Cities podcast with me in Montgomery. And this episode is with Kevin Klinkenberg. And he popped up onto my radar partly through writing about messy cities, and he's been writing about this really, really well with a great audience for far longer than I have. But also, I wrote a little thing a little while back that got picked up by the Strong Towns people, and they're awesome. And they went, do you want to talk to any of our people? And I went, yeah, I'd like to talk to Kevin. So we got hooked up, and we're going to talk all about him and his work. We're going to talk a lot about Kansas City. We're going to talk a lot about American places, and we're really going to talk about sort of philosophy more than specifics. Like when I pushed him on what specific places should we talk about, he didn't really want to talk about them. But there is one in there. Anyway, this is just a really nice chat because we're sort of back into the American world of nobody really looks at America for cities because everyone whinges and moans about cars, but there's people doing amazing stuff, and a lot of American cities are just trying to get back to some of what they were, and Kansas City's a great example of that. Yeah, you know, these conversations are all fantastic. That's why you keep coming back to listen to more of them. So thank you again, and we'll get into a conversation with Kevin Klinkenberg. Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to have a chat with me today. Like, I really appreciate when other people go, you two should have a conversation. So it's how this kind of came about with Karen from Strong Towns putting it in touch.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's always fun to have these kind of conversations. So this is like the fun part of my day.
It's the best part of my day too. And then I have the pleasure of editing them later. I'd love to get started though with, I know you through your Messy City publication, and I really want to talk to you about that. But rather than me bastardize your introduction, how about you just give us a quick introduction to you, and we can go from there.
Well, sure. I guess, I originally grew up in a couple small towns in the Midwest, and I went to architecture school, became an architect, but always had a real interest in cities and urban planning. When I was young, I had no idea what any of that meant. I didn't know anybody who did that kind of work. I didn't know any architects until I actually went to college. So all of that was a huge introduction to me, but I've just always been really fascinated by the built environment and by buildings and maps and cities and all that sort of stuff. And eventually went on to work as an architect with a real focus on master planning and urban planning work, and had my own firm for about a decade. Lived in Kansas City for most of my career after college. And then when the recession hit in 2010, it just kind of blew up everything in the profession and everybody's business, including mine. I decided to take like a 6-month sabbatical and move to Savannah, Georgia, which was a city that I really loved, and ended up staying for 9 years. So 6 months turned into 9 years, and did a whole bunch of other different things besides architecture, including I helped lead a city-funded downtown development authority for 4 years. And then moved back to Kansas City in 2019 after having a couple of kids. And for the last 5.5 years, I've led what's in the jargon is called a place management organization here in Kansas City called Midtown KC Now. And what we do is really help focus on redevelopment issues. We manage 3 community improvement districts in our area, which are like clean and safe programs. And in most areas, they call them BIDs. In my state, they call them CIDs, or community improvement districts. But I still dabble a little bit in development and design when I can. And I'm just super interested in how we make our communities better.
I'm really interested in that sort of, I find in urbanism, you have like architects, and you have the architects who are very much purists of the profession, the work they do. And then you have these architects that then bleed into sort of, it's not quite urban planning, but it's not quite strategy. Like maybe it's being biased because I could never be an architect, but I find that those people really, really interesting because it's like taking a skill that's quite technical and then applying it to something that is very, very messy. That to me is really fascinating. How did you find that?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting that, at its core, I always think about like the education you receive as an architect in a lot of ways is an education in problem solving. And it's a very generalist education. So I had one professor back when I was in school who used to really say the analogy to architecture is the medical profession, and that, everybody is educated. You're as a general practitioner, but very few people actually practice as general practitioners. Overall, you tend to develop a specialty and go with that for your whole career. And architecture is similar, that we're all educated in this kind of generalist fashion. We learn about design, and we learn about structures and all sorts of the various fields of engineering we interact with, and all of that. But very few architects really have a work in a practice where you just kind of design anything. Most architects develop a specialty in an area, a certain type of building or a certain type of client. When I had my firm, our specialty really was more about designing master plan communities, largely for developers, but sometimes for local governments. And so I really felt like the education is kind of a cool way to learn about problem solving. It's not always so good at actually teaching architects how to design beautiful buildings. That's one of the challenges, but it really is a kind of a cool process to think about how to challenge yourself and explore a lot of areas.
And when you're doing what you're doing now in Kansas City, I've never been, this is like one of the rare occasions where I talk to someone I've actually never been there.
Mm-hmm.
What are the sort of problems that you look at and you see in the city today where you're going, that's where we can really help and do something different and make it a better place to live, play, work, etc.?
Well, Kansas City is kind of indicative of a lot of cities in the Midwest or in the upper Midwest, in that we have an older core of the city that really developed from the 1870s to the 90s. That was sort of our boom era historically. And so we have this really rich tapestry of older neighborhoods and older buildings that are really pretty cool. But then we completely and utterly embrace the suburban sprawl mindset. We started in the 90s by demolishing buildings and starting the process of widening roads and sort of building proto freeways in our city. And we embraced it probably like no other city, in North America. And in fact, I think we have more freeway lane miles per capita than any city in the world. And so what happened is we took this kind of old kernel of a city that was built on rivers and railroads and streetcars and walkability, and we blew a lot of it out and built it completely around cars. So now we have a growing region. It's a dynamic region that people are coming to, of over 2 million people, but the urban core has had all of the issues that a lot of other urban cores in Midwestern cities have, with depopulation. Really, when we embraced the car era, we just kind of destroyed a lot of the urban design quality of the city. And really, so a lot of the battle we're fighting is trying to stave off further loss of population, trying to convince people that life in an urban area is actually a good thing and enjoyable, and then trying to rebuild a lot of that fabric that was destroyed in that era where we built big roads and freeways and urban renewal and everything else. So from the part of town that I live and work in, that's what our focus is really trying to have people understand the value of these old places and the value of urbanism and walkability, and then just really enhance it. So it's
How do you do that? How do you go about, I find it fascinating that you use the term battle, and I often wonder if we know it's a battle, but we kind of don't want it to be a battle. It becomes like we don't want to be adversaries where like one person wins, another one loses it. We want to make it so it's see this version of the world that I see that you might not see, and once you've experienced it, then you want more of it, I think is the kind of thing. But like, how do you find making that case in Kansas City?
It's not easy. You kind of fight battles on multiple fronts and in ways that you don't often expect. So we have one front of people who live in the suburbs and who think the city is scary and it's hard to park your car and everything else. And what are you going to do? And so, but we need to attract those people for our area to be successful. So we try to demystify that and make it easy for people to navigate the city. At the same time, we have to try to educate the population of people that still is in the city about what were the conditions that actually made our city successful originally. And it's probably no surprise to a lot of people, but we have a very large share of NIMBYs in the city who paradoxically just don't really want things to change very much, and they don't understand the historic context from what built the city the way it was and what things were actually like. And I say one of the challenges we have is there are a lot of people who moved into the city in really the bad old days, and they bought beautiful old houses or buildings very, very inexpensively in the 70s and 80s. and they've lived there since then. And when they did that, the city was very, very quiet, and it was dangerous, and there wasn't much business happening, but there was a quietness to it that I think people liked. And we have a really hard time, talking to those people about overcoming the notion that if our city is going to be successful, it's actually going to have not just more people, but like 2 or 3 times more people, because that's what we lost. And it's just going to be a lot busier and different than this kind of sleepy little idea that you have in your head. And so there's lots of surprising people who you think should be allies in your city are not always allies for change.
How do you? I think it's really interesting when you have people who live in a city, and then when you get things like noise, they seem upset that there's noise. Isn't that what? If you want that, if you don't want noise, why are you here?
Mm-hmm.
But I hadn't necessarily thought about it in the context of like people who turned up when the city was quiet because it was in that sort of doldrums era.
Yeah. Yeah. And by the same token, like when they bought those houses, they could park their car right on the street in front of their house or everywhere they want to go. And so the notion of like that parking might get harder for them. And now a lot of these people are older, obviously, and we live in a car-oriented city and society. So that's how a lot of people get around. But the idea that they might have to pay for parking or that it could get harder to park on their block is really challenging for people to try to deal with.
How do you overcome this? How do you make the case for the change? Because I think it can feel like overwhelming to do it in one go, and I guess it's a matter of like chipping away at things.
Yeah, there is some of that chipping away. We talk to people, we try to survey people and ask them like, what are the things that you want? What is it you really want? And invariably, we find people in the city who really they want the city to be more walkable and pedestrian friendly. They want to have more local businesses. They want better transit service. And so what we have to talk about is, okay, we want these things. Well, all these things are going to require us needing more people in the city to support it all. And in our little part of the urban core, we tried to use a little bit of information to help people understand the big picture. And in our big picture, the neighborhoods we work in, the peak population year was 1950. In the 1950 census, we had 73,000 people in these neighborhoods. And today we have 28,000.
Wow. Okay.
So we lost 2/3 of that population. And even worse than that, in that 1950 peak population year, our household incomes were at or above the regional average. And now they're below it. So we try to talk to people about we need more people living here. We need more people who have disposable income. If you want to have those cool local shops and businesses to go to, if you want to have the better bus service, better public services, we've just got to have more people. That's going to mean a different scenario than the way things are today.
I feel like that density word really scares people.
It does.
Like, how do you come up with a language that makes people go like, you know what, this isn't scary. This is something that's been had before and I can handle this.
Yeah, actually, it's good you mentioned that because I hate using that word. There's a lot of planner jargon I really try to avoid. Density is a word I try to avoid because first of all, density is just math. You don't get any idea of quality from density. You could have the same exact mathematical number of density that could be really great or really awful. It doesn't mean anything. It's an interesting analysis tool, but it doesn't mean anything for people's day-to-day experience. So I try to find ways to, wherever we can, to talk to people about things that they might understand that's a little bit more, I guess, emotional or whatever. Like, would you like your kids to be able to walk to an ice cream store down the block? Would you like it if the city had more funds at its disposal to repair your sidewalks and plant trees and do the sorts of things that it needs to do?
Yeah, it's like I find it really interesting watching when Americans go on vacation, especially to Europe. I was in Rome the other week, and I could only tell you that they were Midwestern, but I was quite enjoying watching them have this debate around like where they were getting off and where they were going to in Rome on the metro. And the guy was like, no, I don't mind if we get off in the wrong place because we can walk to, like, this is a great city to wander around. And the lady was like, I'm so tired of walking. I wish we could have just got a taxi. They were having this argument about like being like, I think he was really enjoying himself and she wasn't particularly enjoying herself.
Yeah.
But it's interesting when Americans go on vacation to places like that and then go home. I see, like, I guess like some just slip back into like, we're home, that was a nice novelty, and some sort of come back and go, how can I make this change? Or how can I bring a little bit of this to where I live?
Yeah, I mean, there's the old joke was we will spend thousands and thousands of dollars to travel somewhere where you just walk around, for a week or two, and then suddenly realize we can't do that at home. And instead of just like trying to improve our community, so you could do that. But I mean, it's one of the things I used to talk about in presentations is I really do think though that there was a really important cultural change was when a lot of young Americans were able to do study abroad programs
Hmm.
and really starting in earnest in probably the 70s or maybe the 60s, but picked up steam in the 80s. I did some of it in the 80s and 90s. And for a lot of young Americans, when you go overseas and if you can live somewhere overseas for a month, 2 months, 3 months, it changes your perspective on a lot of things. And I think there are literally millions of American kids who did that and experienced what life is like in other cities where you could just walk everywhere. And that radicalized a lot of them and came back and said, how do I do this in where I live?
Hmm. And then I guess it's not just like the residents that you've got is the people to convince. You've then got to convince the city and the
Hmm.
corporations and the
Yeah.
companies that
Yeah.
exist there. How do you get them in the mindset of like, here's what can be possible versus sort of folding their arms and sort of being like, no, we can't be that.
That's a tough thing too. And working with city government in our city is a huge challenge. We've probably had more success just by trying to peel off little improvement projects here and there and finding small opportunities to make a block more pedestrian friendly, make an intersection better, do what we can in modest steps than trying to do the great big things. Now, we do have a new streetcar extension project in our city that is opening later this year. That is a massive project, but it's 10 years in the making. So like those things don't happen quickly. And so I think where we try to really focus, I have found it's so much easier to work with our partners in public works or planning or whatever to do small incremental changes and improvements rather than drastic changes. The drastic changes in a city of our size just take so long and they're very, very controversial and they often just don't happen.
Hmm.
So if we can find ways to make incremental change, that's what we try to do.
And I guess that incremental change then becomes kind of addictive.
Yeah,
It's like, we did that, or what's the next thing that we can do? I guess.
absolutely. Yeah.
What are some of the best projects that have been examples of that for you, where you look and go, I'm really proud of that one. That was a great one that kickstarted this other thing. Like, what's the sort of sequence, I guess?
Well, we started working a few years ago near this kind of micro park on Main Street in our area, and we got a small grant, like 25 grand, to make some improvements to it, and then we found some other money to make improvements and just really try to make it a better used, more attractive space. And then we, on the block or two around it, we're able to help get some bump outs built in the street that we can landscape and make the pedestrian crossings shorter, more attractive, more interesting. That all really spurred a lot of interest in our people that like, hey, we can do these things. We can actually make some more projects. So we took that idea and we expanded it to two other whole areas where we're redoing streets, kind of a block at a time. One of the cool things that came out of that is we had a core group of people who became really interested in making improvements like that. And we asked the question 2 years ago, well, what do you want to do next? And they all agreed they wanted to start working on, there was an idea for an art walk in our part of town. We have some tremendous museums and cultural institutions in our part of the city that are even nationally famous. And for 30 or 40 years, there have been these big dreams of, incredible plans about creating an art walk that links it all up and unifies the area, makes it interesting and encourages people to move around on foot between all the institutions, which they don't really do now. And so our group said, well, let's take on that. And so starting about 2 years ago, we started getting people together and I said, okay, we're going to do this, but we're not going to do the whole thing. We're going to find the smallest piece that we can bite off and get done that will make a difference. And so we picked a 3-block stretch. We were able to finally get all the institutions at the table together, working together, which they had never really done in any tangible way, and raise a little money to hire a branding and marketing consulting firm here locally. And then we got some terrific pro bono work from a local design firm. And earlier this year, we unveiled the results of that. And we have this new art walk that we're calling the Artery, Arterie, that will have wayfinding up for this fall as the first stage of that. And it has been tremendous. This whole group has gotten so excited about all of it. It's really each month we have like basically like a new person who comes on board from a new group who wants to help join the effort and extend it. And I think we've created something that's going to be, over time, an incredible attraction for the city and just a really great way to improve people walking around the city and enjoying it. But that all grew out of just kind of a spirit of what's sort of the next incremental thing that we can do to make something happen.
I really love that philosophy of here's the big, like, exciting future,
Mm-hmm.
but then here's the smallest possible thing we can do right now that sets you on the way. Because
Right.
like everything in innovation and development is momentum, and if you try and set yourself too lofty a goal and you stumble, it's
Right.
hard to get back up again and go again. Like people are looking at me funny. I've lost a bit of like face here. Whereas if you like do a little bit and a little bit, then it's like people are like, go harder, run faster, you can do more than you've done. And I think that's just like it's so applicable across all sorts of different realms of trying to do something new.
Yeah.
It feels so sensible that that's something you do in urbanism, but often like people get hung up on like the master plan, not necessarily on the more tactical things, right?
Yeah, and and I'm somebody I've done a lot of master plans in my time, and I like doing them. And I think there is an element of that that's really important because I think people love big visions and they're
Yeah.
attracted to them. I kind of always go back to that old movie It's a Wonderful Life where George Bailey is talking about he wants to build, huge skyscrapers and bridges and wants to do all this exciting stuff, and like that's a natural part of being human. We want to do big things. We want to do exciting things. And so I think there's a role for that and for illustrating for people like the possibilities. Here's the big possibilities if you just thought differently about your part of town. But you just can't get too hung up on that. You've got to be able to turn the page. One of the examples I used to use in presentations all the time was everybody loves to quote Daniel Burnham in The Plan of Chicago. It says, make no small plans. And because I'm going to screw that up, but something about fail to stir the imaginations of men or whatever.
Yeah.
And that is true. That's a great quote, and he uses that's right up front in The Plan of Chicago. It literally, like the next page, he has this like 2-paragraph long explanation about that's all great, but you've got to get started and do small things. You've got to take action. And that's, I think, often what we've lost. We're like really cool. We're really good at doing the big, sexy plan, at least the imagery of it. And a lot of projects fail because they get stuck on the big imagery. And they, instead of thinking about the next increment of something that they could do to implement it, they're really hung up on, we've got to do the enormous catalytic project or else this won't happen.
Yeah.
Instead of like working up to the catalytic project.
It's that you see it in business where people like get obsessed with plans, and the exercise of doing the planning is hugely valuable because it opens your mind, broadens you up to like possibilities, and shows you what you could do. But when you've made that master plan in an urban context, or when you've made that strategic plan in a corporate context, so ultimately on day 2 or day 3 a spanner's going to get thrown in the works, but you should be more agile to it because you've done the planning, not necessarily dogmatically going back and being, but step 2 of the plan was this. It's like, yeah, but step 2, now we're doing step 6 first because there's a different, messier route to ultimately get to the common outcome, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started doing master planning work as a young architect, I was working on small college campuses, which, college campuses are like cities in miniature.
Yeah.
And so we would do these master plans, and you do them, and you kind of have the horizon that you're thinking of, a 20 or 30-year horizon when you do these plans. But the reality is it's impossible to plan for perfection. It's just impossible because life changes so quickly. The big joke we always had with college master plans was it's all great until the next important donor dies. And when that donor dies and they bequeath, $5 million to the university for some facility, that's going to be the next project. And then you've got to rework your plan and figure out how it's going to make sense. So, I mean, I had one college that I probably did 3 master plans on in a span of 15 years. Because it's just things and leadership changes and, people's desires change, the market changes. A lot of that work ultimately is what kind of led me to this concept of like messy cities. And you know, getting setting goals and imagery is great, but you can just never, you can't expect to be perfect. You have to be able to be flexible.
I feel like this term messy is really having its moment because you have the messy cities thing, and I think you planted your flag early.
A few years ago,
Um,
yeah.
but there's like a book that's just come out called Messy
Yeah.
Cities, which is like a collection of essays, and it's like
Uh-huh.
people in Toronto who've sort of put it out.
Right.
I'm a big fan of the behavioral scientist Rory Sutherland, and like he does a thing called Nudge Stock every year. And last year his talk was all about embracing the mess
Uh-huh.
and not following logical linear processes. But like, I want to get your thought of like, I think messy can mean different things to some different
Right.
people, and some people will use messy as a negative term.
Sure.
Whereas like we're now claiming messy is like the really positive, that is a good thing,
Yeah.
as a virtue. But like, I'd love to get your sort of what's the backstory to laying claim to that term messy cities, because I think it's
Well,
fantastic.
I suppose, like I said, some of it started by doing a lot of master plans, seeing a lot of failure, seeing a lot of plans that just don't get executed for a variety of reasons, and then trying to understand like why that happened, and also really trying for me to understand the places that I love the most, that I have always been the most interested in, like what was behind the curtain on those. How did they work? How did they come to be a certain way? So thinking less about as an architect and more as like a system designer, like what were the systems behind it? What was the culture, et cetera? So that was a big part of it. And then also, I think the older you get, you tend to learn that like life is messy. It's good to have, it's not a bad idea to have like a plan in mind for your life, or like a 5-year plan for the next 5 years. But you also know just life comes at you from a lot of directions. There's so much you can't predict that's going to happen. And if you want to be a healthy person mentally, you've got to learn to roll with it. You've got to learn to accept the messiness of life. You got to learn to accept your own flaws, accept the flaws of your friends and family. Otherwise, you'll drive yourself insane. And there's a beauty to that. There's a beauty into the fact that people aren't people. At the end of the day, cities are nothing more than just collections of people. And so there is a messiness to how cities proceed. And really, the sort of the hubris of the 20th century model for cities, which created the suburban experiment and it created urban renewal, was that we could perfectly scientifically predict and manage cities and behavior. Both of those have failed in different ways. And really what I like to talk about is that sort of bottom up approach that embraces the messiness of life is really what has historically produced the most interesting places, the places that people love the most. And it just, more than anything, it comports with reality. Like that's how life is. So let's not try to say that we can have the perfect zoning, the perfect regulation, the perfect standard for everything. We've got to be an embracingness of the fact that things are going to be imperfect. And that's not just okay. It actually can be truly wonderful.
Are there places that you look to as that example of messy cities that, they're the poster children, they're the ones that you go like, this shouldn't work, but it really, really does work, that you can try and make the case for the change?
Well, there are. I hesitate to mention specific ones because I don't want people to get too hung up on specific examples. I think more in my mind, generically, it's a lot of the place, almost any place that was probably built before like the 90s, before we really put in place a lot of very rigid approaches to the built environment and really radically changed how we approach building things, designing and building and communities. And so wherever you are in the world, there are great examples of that. And they exist on every continent. They existed all across North America in that era. I have my favorite spots in my city. I'll mention one crazy little example just because hardly anybody knows about it. But
Do you want people to know about it? You like some of these things like you want to keep
no,
hidden?
it's fine. I mean, people in Kansas City would know about it, but outside of Kansas City would. There's a small town outside of Kansas City called Weston, Missouri, and it is a tiny little town that used to be on the Missouri River. And then there was 100 years ago, there was a flood, and the river moved. It moved a few miles away, as rivers used to do much more commonly. The channel moved. And so when the river moved, the town basically began a slow, gradual death. And it was rediscovered in the probably 80s um, by people as a quaint little town, and has become like a getaway place, like a weekend getaway place. You go there and stay at a B&B and go shop and dine and everything else. Well, I mentioned it all because what happened was Weston became so poor that they didn't have the money to tear down their buildings. And commonly what happened in places that declined but still had money is they had enough money to tear their buildings down, and real problems. The places that were so poor that they couldn't tear anything down, they retained some of the visual character of that place. So Weston, I always like to joke, the main street of Weston is like 2 blocks long. And it is, it's a funky collection of buildings that you would never probably design on purpose as a set piece. And some of them are really banal, but yet the whole thing works.
Mhm.
And you go there and those 2 blocks are good enough that it's an attraction for an entire region to go to. And there's so much like that. There's a lot of our older places that have a lot of very imperfect collections of buildings that still have a charm to them that is interesting. And if you go to older countries and older cultures, if you kind of peel back the layers of like stopping, like turning off your brain that you're thinking that you're looking at some like gorgeous old Italian town and these are so sophisticated, these people are amazing, they've blah blah, they have this incredible food and wine. But then you peel it back and like look at their buildings and everything, they're all almost always incredibly simple.
Yeah.
And most of them were done, nearly all of them were built before things were professionalized. They were often done by just lay people and amateurs who were kind of copying each other. And so there's a lot of imperfection in that. And then mixed in once in a while, you'll find the beautiful, perfectly designed building by a professional.
Mhm.
And that's the nature of how most human settlements were for thousands of years. And so those are the things that I think are really most interesting to me.
I love that example of the city was too broke to knock down the old buildings.
Yeah.
And you actually look at a lot of the places that are kind of everyone sort of fawns over, and I'm like, I don't want to be the guy that's like, I get so tired of people going, we're not people going, we're not Amsterdam. It's like, yeah, you're not meant to try and be Amsterdam either.
Right.
But like, I've just been in Copenhagen, and the Copenhagen story is like, we were so broke and we'd lost half our population, so we were at the point where we're like so done for. We had to do something radically different to go and change things. And I think like that's the poverty story has like a really interesting implication of what it means for cities.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
people are so resourceful. People will find a way to make the most of a bad hand.
Right.
And yeah.
Especially if there's something about the place that they love, if there's a charm or a character or quality to it that appeals to them on more than just a surface level, it's not utilitarian. So people will find a way. It's the same way that, most of the great cuisines of the world came out of people who were very poor and they were experimenting with stuff to try to figure out how to make it more palatable. You see that everywhere. And there's just incredible food we take for granted now that really came out of just poverty.
Yeah. If you want to talk Italian food, that's the whole story of Italian food is
Yeah.
making do with what we've got.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then like in terms of like that case for messy, I think that's like really interesting because like the example that you give is like really small scale, really manageable. And I think when you translate that to big cities, often people are thinking like, how do we connect these bits together all perfectly? And actually you can have like that rough edge of the architecture style doesn't quite match, or maybe the sidewalk sort of changes and it doesn't all necessarily fit into this uniform ideal. But that's what gives, you use the charm word, and I really like the charm word. That's what gives the place the charm. That's how that, so you then have the sort of the emotional connection to it versus just it being like a functionally attractive city.
Yeah, and I'm not arguing for that like everything is just okay. I'm still an architect at the end of the day. I still think we should strive to do beautiful buildings and beautiful places as much as we can. We try to improve our places here in our part of town by really enhancing the landscaping and striving hard for beautification as much as we can, because I think that's important. I think humans need to experience beauty on a day-to-day basis. So I don't argue for just like anything is okay. I think there are things that just are kind of soul crushing. There's a lot of new building that is not great. But that said, there's a lot of different versions of what beauty can be. And it's interesting when things kind of mash up and work together. And one of the ways in which we can find a lot of beauty is just those things that ordinary people touch and change on their own, that are not in one of the design professions.
You talk about the ordinary people thing. Like, I think there's a lot of people looking at cities going, but it's not my responsibility, or I'd like to do something, but I'm not. My opinion or my effort isn't wanted, or I'm not allowed to do something. How can people get? How do you help sort of lay people get involved with this? Because I think there's a lot of people that sort of have this, like, I look at this, people who listen to this podcast or like read the things, and the feedback I get is, but what can I do? Because I'm not an architect, I'm not an urban planner. Or they'll turn up at a consultation meeting and it's full of people who are very vocal naysayers to a development. And the person's made the effort, who's actually like, I like this, can I suggest an idea? They feel rejected. So how do normal people play a role in this? Because I think you talked about it with the artery a little bit,
Yeah.
but I think that's a thing that people are really struggling with.
Well, I mean, I think if you leave everything to the professionals, they'll screw up your city. So I think it's absolutely imperative that people find a way to get involved, and not necessarily always by getting involved by like shouting at people or going to lots of meetings, but finding ways to just do things yourself. And I know in really big cities that can be a huge challenge, is to try to understand how any one person can kind of impact a place. It's much easier in a smaller town, a smaller city, where you might know who the people are that work in your city, and it might just be easier to take action. But I still think you just got to find ways to figure out how can you, and maybe you or a couple of your neighbors or whatever, take action. So I think the strong towns ethos is really helpful in this regard, which is identify like a pain point, for people, whatever that is. And maybe it's as simple as like, there's a street crossing here that's difficult to cross. And then you just figure out, how do we make that one thing better? How, my street had a bunch of trees that were cut down and nothing has been replanted. How do we figure out how to get some trees planted on our street? If you're in a place where you own a property, it's easier to understand how to make improvements than if you're renting. But I don't think there still are ways to try to solve small problems. And once you figure out how to solve a small problem, you'll get more interested to solve bigger problems too. I think, another thing a lot of people lack is just a real sense of community in neighborhoods. And in big cities, again, I think that's harder. It's just a little more impersonal. There's so many people. So just finding ways that you can to just connect with neighbors and create events, dinners, lunches, activities, festivals, whatever you can, just so that people are out and about enjoying a place. That's and then probably the most radical way that, I don't shy away from advising people on is, sometimes the right thing to do is just to move, and, just to find a different place where you actually can have an impact on your community, where an individual can make a difference. And that's not going to be for everybody, obviously, but for some people that might just be the best way to go. And there are tons and tons of cities and towns out there who are just dying for people to invest their energy in improving it.
As the thing that sort of comes to mind is, I think a lot of people hated this, but like Domino's Pizza did the thing of the potholes.
Hmm.
So like, oh, this is damaging pizzas when they get to people's places. So they were like repairing potholes themselves and then putting the Domino's logo on them.
Yeah.
And some people looked at it and was like, that's like a really crass way of dealing with it. And how bad is our society when a pizza company is doing road repairs? And I think cities were like going, that's not legal. That's not compliant by the code. Blah blah
Yeah.
blah. But I thought it was a really good way of like drawing attention to what can be done. And the UK equivalent of that was, there was an artist called Wanksy, and he would just draw penises on top
Hmm.
of potholes, so that the council would come and fix the pothole because they didn't look like something
Well,
vulgar
there you
drawn
go.
on top of it.
That's a way to do it.
So I'm not advocating for that, like,
Yeah.
done everywhere, but like, I think there's like really interesting examples of that, which is like moves that people can make
Yeah.
that then draw people's attention to it, and then the actual the formal power brokers, then like that's embarrassing. We've been shown up here. We've got to step up our game too.
Years ago, I used to live on a one-way street where people would drive way too fast all the time just because it was one way. And I had some neighbors who simply took a little kid's tricycle and put it out in the middle of the road like every so often. And it was remarkable how just like doing that one thing, you could sit out there and the speed of traffic was so much different. I mean, it was incredible because people, not just the thing that was in the road, but people had an instinct of like, oh, there might be kids here. I better slow down.
Yeah. I feel, a few weeks ago, my wife was like driving very slowly down a street near our house, but a kid had kicked a ball over a fence, and the immediate reaction was as soon as she saw the ball, she was like, "Where's the child?" But like doing those sort of things, it really brings it home to people of like what really matters, and it's not you getting to your destination 20 seconds faster.
Right.
So I think this is that you touched on this at the start, but there's like you have this sort of downtown thing, and then you have the suburban thing. You can kind of get into this sort of this battle, but there's also this like connecting tissue through a city of some people just want to live in the suburbs, and that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
Some people like having a 4-bedroom single family home, large lot, backyard,
Sure,
and so on. Cool. Like it should never be about like that shouldn't be a possible thing. And then you have this sort of connecting tissue that like in the US is often things like a Strode and a strip mall. Are you starting to see more like how do we connect these cities? Because we're not going to move all these people from the suburbs downtown.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is that we just stop sprawling out so much. Are you seeing the sort of thread of how do we bring this sort of generational city or multi-generational city together?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of fantasies in our world, in our realm, right? There's certainly like suburban people who have the fantasy that you're just going to magically clean up the whole city and make it easy to drive and park in, and it's all going to work. And then there's the urbanist fantasy that we're going to magically turn all the suburbs into, incredible walkable, urban neighborhoods, which is not going to happen either. And there's another fantasy, I would say, that says that a lot of these suburbs are going to go away over time. I think there may be some places that are so economically challenged that they could decline into oblivion. But I think the reality is most of what will exist on the ground in say 2050 exists today, and probably 80 or 90% of it. Then you have the question of, right, well, what do people want? Like, how do you make a place more livable, more desirable? And there are some ways. One of the things that I've kind of argued for, like in a lot of the suburban areas, I mean, you're right. There's obviously a huge market of people who really enjoy living in sort of a standard, like American suburb. And that's fine. I mean, there's no problem. Most of my family does, and they love it. And that's great. And I'm happy for them. I'm happy that they enjoy that lifestyle. It's not for me, and it's not the way I want to live, but there are lots of people who like that. There are also people who complain about things that they wish were better in those areas too. And a lot of it has to do with traffic. A lot of it has to do with alternate ways of getting around, whether it's like walking or riding a bike to different things. A lot of it has to do with maybe ugliness of shopping areas and strip malls and that sorts of things. And they wish they had more quaint, sort of small townish feeling, like town centers to go to. So I think there are opportunities to do a lot of those things without really massively thinking that those have to reconfigure those areas. So there are certain techniques that might help. I mean, one of the things that we've started to see a little bit of in our area that I hope we see more of. This is like a very technical sort of dive into this, but there's an awful lot of intersections in suburban areas that could easily be converted to roundabouts, which, as you know, is common throughout most of the world, like all over Great Britain, Australia, most of the English-speaking world, right? And most. A
few things terrify me more than driving around a roundabout in America, and it's not my problem with driving around it; it's the other people's problem around
people aren't as used to it. Yeah, there's a bit of a learning curve, but there's a reason that like that technique exists all over the world because it's super simple and it works and it's inexpensive to do. And so the technical aspect of all that is what most people don't understand. I've had to learn things about traffic engineering I never thought I would ever have to learn, but you have to learn these things if you want to like make a difference and be able to speak to other professionals. Most of the cause of traffic backups are intersections. That's where people stop. That's where things get bogged down. So if you have intersections that can become more efficient at moving traffic through them, then you can actually take roadways and maybe reduce them by a lane in each direction. Because what happens is roads are designed with extra lanes so that people can stack up at intersections. Well, the beauty of roundabouts is they allow traffic to flow through them much more efficiently than a signal does. And oh, by the way, they're also much cheaper over the long term to build and maintain. And so I think there are some pretty cool opportunities in suburban areas to think about retrofitting a lot of key intersections with roundabouts and then allowing for what we call road diets, which is, eliminating a lane or two. And that might then allow you the opportunity to add bike trails, to add street parking where you can, to create an environment where you could do some of those more modest changes that people talk about. It'd be great if we could bike around this area more. It'd be great if we could change the shopping areas more. And then you might start to see some of those things.
I think there's like a really interesting thing. I've written about this before, but like cycling is often an identity in North America.
Yeah.
Whereas like cycling in a lot of European cities, it's like somebody just going to work on a bike
Right.
that actually isn't terribly well maintained and isn't the fastest, and they're not in a rush trying to maximize the amount of pedaling that they do.
Right.
And then you start to see sort of electric cargo bikes on streets in Copenhagen or Amsterdam. And I actually think the Danes and the Dutch kind of hate them because the bike lanes haven't really been designed for them. But when I look at like the US, it's actually like in a lot of cities in North America, an electric cargo bike can be a fantastic thing.
It's great. Yeah.
Because you can go it's a bit further of a distance to go to some of the shops, and you might buy things in a bigger packaging size, and then you've got to take them home. That just seems nicer than driving a car to the shops.
Yeah.
But it's an unlock of like, you actually don't know how nice this is until you tried it, but then how do you get people to try it? So I think your example of like roundabouts is then like these roads in suburban bits of American cities. Then you kind of have a bit more space for this, and it's not just a token bike lane with paint down the side of a busy highway. It's actually thoughtful space.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's a really nice example of then how do you stitch a city together, and then how do you change behavior over time versus having to do it overnight or assume people just adopt the behavior without the incentive.
Yeah. And you really hit on something there too, related to biking and e-bikes. So I have an e-bike. My wife and I do. We love them. You're totally right. The e-bike phenomenon is really, I feel like, catering to American cities.
Mm-hmm.
And not cities in the rest of the world, because the things are just more spread out. The distances are longer. And so it's really nice to have that extra assist to go farther. And they're also a ton of fun. They're really fun to ride.
Yeah.
But they're not fun to ride everywhere. It's just, but I could see where, like certainly in the Netherlands, where you have cities that are designed first and foremost for people walking and biking, that somebody cruising by at 28 miles an hour on an e-bike is going to piss a lot of people off, right? That's not, people aren't going to be happy about that.
I was in Poland last week, and I wanted to get a bike to go from Gdansk to up the coast to where the beach is. It's like, I don't know, 17-kilometer ride, but there was like a wind warning of 50, 60 kilometer an hour winds, and riding in the wind sucks.
Yeah.
So, but the city bike share was fantastic. I was like, I don't know, they cover like $12, and you got 48 hours access to the bike share, and you could ride an electric bike for 4 hours a day. Anything over that, then you had to pay. So it was like really affordable to use it. But there's no way I would have done that ride on a regular bike. Whereas on an e-bike, you're like, okay, don't really feel it now, and it gives you a lot more freedom to go do things. And I don't. It's one of those things of until you like. When I first rode an e-bike, it was probably 6-7 years ago. I actually was like, you have to ride the bike differently as well. You kind of have to like know how to ride an e-bike.
Yes.
Not ride it like a regular bike.
For sure.
Have a bit more awareness. But once you've done it, you're like, hang on a minute, it's actually like a totally different kind of vehicle to a regular bicycle that you might have ridden when you were younger and poorer.
Yeah. Yeah. As you think about a lot of those suburban areas too. So I get fixated a little bit on roundabouts and traffic. I probably spent too much time designing that stuff, and that's why I think about it. But when you also think about like the building side, I mean, I really hope that more suburban areas can start to embrace allowing people have the flexibility to do little carriage houses or cottages on the back part of their property or on a part of the lawn, because that is also something that I think can really help a lot of suburban areas mature in a very elegant way and successful way. And I think about that from I've always been a big fan of that type of building anyway. What the planners call accessory dwelling units now, or
Hmm.
ADUs. I've owned a couple properties that had them, and they're tremendously beneficial. From a financial standpoint, from a social standpoint, they're really cool. But I thought about this again recently when my parents got to a point where they just couldn't live in their suburban house anymore. They moved in with one of my sisters in their suburban house just down the street. And so my sister and her husband essentially had to give up their master bedroom suite and move upstairs so my parents could move in. And they were happy to do it. They would do anything for my parents. And so that they could live on the main level without having to, go up and down stairs, which they just got a point where they couldn't do that.
Hmm.
And I it just couldn't help but think about if my sister had had some sort of a small accessory dwelling unit or cottage on the back lawn of their property, which is a huge lawn that was sort of an independent living space, that would have been so much more of a dignified way for my parents to spend their last, few years. And I mean, they of course they were fine, and my sister and her husband were fine. But then my sister and her husband could have kept their, bedroom the way they were. It's just there's just so much more flexibility that you have when you allow for those things to happen in the built environment. And as we have an aging society, I think those issues become more and more important. People don't generally want to move to nursing homes. And if you have the flexibility on your site to accommodate uses like that, I think that's great. And unfortunately, a lot of cities just don't even allow that.
You're back to that sort of planning thing of if we're thinking planning in the long term, like that's where a lot of us we're going to live longer, but we're going to sort of need
Yeah.
more help as we age.
Yeah.
And we've developed these things where it actually can be really isolating with how we
Right.
live.
Right.
That's the planning thing, and it's not so much the have to do it this way, but it's a understanding these are going to be the implications and the trends into the future. That's the sort of strategic foresight that we've got to have.
Yeah.
And then there's multiple different versions of right answers for how we handle it. And for something like you said earlier of what can people do? Well, they can just move.
Right.
But then there's that actually, how can you be adaptable with the place that you already live in? Because that
Right.
suburban environment, you actually have this luxury of a ton of space. I think it's like that. You can get really creative with what the future looks like there.
No doubt.
So I like to sort of end these conversations on if you had a magic wand and you could apply it to maybe it's the city you're living in, maybe it's more generally, but like step back a little bit from the day-to-day constraints and restrictions. What would you do with a magic wand to make better challenger cities?
It's a tough one.
It's my favorite question.
I have a bunch of crazy radical ideas that I toy with from time to time.
Please, this is what we want. This is a space for it. Yeah.
And a lot of them probably get too wonky in like the policy wonk world. But if I could wave a magic wand, my city, the city that I live in itself, the city proper is about 500,000 people. And it's very, very spread out. It's over 300 square miles. I would wave a magic wand and carve the city up into little units of like 25,000 people, 50,000 people, something like that. And everything would be managed at that scale. Because I think one of the things that we lost a lot with modernity and with big cities is um, there's the intimacy of scale. So it's just so easy to get lost and not have a sense of community or purpose in your place. You just exist there. You consume it, but you don't have a lot of you're not necessarily attached to it. Smaller towns have that. So I had that when I lived in a small town. But there's also, there's a lot of people aren't going to live in a small town. They're going to live in a big city or in a metropolitan area. And I would love to figure out how do we carve up our larger cities so that they're effectively thought of as, and not just thought of, but like actively managed in much smaller units, so that you still know who the person is to call to help you do X, Y, or Z. You know who your elected official is because you see him at the grocery store or the restaurant down the street. There's just such an impersonal nature to size and scale that is not always good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that causes a lot of our problems, a lot of our issues. There's so many things that come off of that from just the problem of scale. And I would love to just descale everything somehow, and help people make those connections better and feel a sense of attachment to a smaller place.
I think Montreal might actually offer a good example of that, because we kind of have a mayor, and we have political parties at the municipal level, which other Canadian cities don't. And then some Montreal will correct me on this, I'm sure. I've not been here that long. But you have these borough mayors.
Mm-hmm.
So each, as the city's divided up, and the thing that Montreal got famous for is like the plateau. And a guy kind of won there, was a bit quite rebellious, but like very much sort of like, right, we're going to widen these sidewalks, we're going to make these streets one way, we're going to and he pissed off a lot of people, and to the point where I think he thought, I'm not going to get re-elected, and and I think he was actually getting death threats at like the most extreme level of it. But he then got re-elected with a greater majority, and then it became, I think like that was it was almost like the prototype for, hang on a minute, we can widen sidewalks, we can plant more trees, we can remove street parking. And then other borough mayors start to look at that and go, well, I'm going to apply it, and it then be like leveled up to the city level. But it almost gives you this license of, and I think like this is something I'd love to do it. You can push it as hard as you want, but you almost end up with like the skunk works of various bits of the city. So if you have like a certain bit of the city that's a bit more ambitious, rebellious, naughty even, they can go play with things. And then if you've got the more conservatives on the other side being like, oh, we don't like that, well, it doesn't impact you.
Right.
And then if you want to copy it later, you've got the blueprint. I think that's, I like, as a magic wand, I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, I just think there's so many problems we've created by like everything has to be like universally applied. And in bigger cities or bigger jurisdictions, that's even more of a challenge. So I know it's a very wonky thing to think about, but it's something that's just been occupying a lot of my...
Wonky things end up being like really good things. Like, the whole thing we need is like more opportunism, more opportunistic thinking, more experimentalism. So like, yeah, I want these things to come out, and maybe someone somewhere is going, that's just crazy enough, I might give it a go. Let's give Kevin a call. But Kevin, thank you so much. You've been a joy to chat to. You've got my brain going on so many different things, and like I just hope it's helpful to folks going like, you know what, I can do a little thing. So
yeah, well, I love having these conversations, so I appreciate the invite and the opportunity. Brilliant.
I'll put a link to Messy City in the show notes and in the write-up as well, so people can follow you too. Great, thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, so the podcast is everywhere, and then there's a Substack that goes with it. Awesome. Thank you so much. You listened all the way through. You're a good person. If you liked it, let me know. If you liked it, let other people know. If you didn't like it, don't let other people know. But if you didn't like it, tell me what you didn't like and how we can make this better. If there's people that you'd love to have interviewed, if you yourself think, you know what, I'd make a really good guest at the podcast, then do get in touch. And once again, we'll see you again very soon for another episode of the Challenger Cities podcast. Cheers. Bye-bye.